Well, welcome to our final day of Is Our Democracy in Danger? I hope everyone remembered to bring their evaluation forms and pencils with them. If you forgot, there are some blank forms and pencils in the back. Once we wrap up class and you have filled out your form, there are 2 manila envelopes at the back of the auditorium. Just tuck your completed form into one of the envelopes. Those on Zoom can just drop off your completed form in the learner's cubby for your building. And if for some reason you cannot complete your evaluation today, that is fine. Just try to return it by this Friday, and you can return it to my personal cubby or any learner's cubby. So on with the questions from last week. A rather complicated question here. Our member asked, which of the following scenarios most threatens our democracy? Donald Trump wins the election and surrounds himself with lackeys and yes men for cabinet members and advisors. Or number 2, Donald Trump loses the election but refuses to accept the result and attempts to overthrow the government and establish himself as the president. Option 1 seems more threatening, simply because Trump will be back in office and have the powers of the presidency at his disposal. In the last term, he hired establishment types who held back his worst impulses. But now we've learned that most of his former employees would never work for him again. From the 40 members of his previous administration, only 7 have agreed to endorse him this time around, and 17 have publicly criticized him, claiming he is unfit for office. So clearly Trump is not going to be hiring those who will rein him in. So there will be no buffers this time around. Trump is only going to hire those folks who are true believers and will carry out his orders without question. It really will be the wild, wild west this time around. But if he should lose the election, he will be even less successful at overthrowing the government because he will not have the same powers of the presidency. The Justice Department will still be operating independently and arresting the people who are leading the insurrection. It will be Kamala Harris overseeing the counting of the ballots, not Mike Pence. And everyone will be much more prepared this time around. So another question, what role does religion play in all of this? The Constitution prohibits the Congress from either establishing a religion, favoring one religion over another, or interfering with the exercise of any religious practice. This is commonly known as the separation of church and state. So while there is no official role for religions to play, our religious communities often encourage their members to vote, volunteer in their communities, and to run for office, thus promoting good civic engagement. And that's a good thing. Many religions teach values that are compatible with democracy, such as the respect for human rights, the rule of law, tolerance, and pluralism. Religious communities can speak out against injustice and corruption, and they can advocate for policies that promote the common good, something like what we saw with the African-American churches during the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, we also know that religion can support and justify authoritarian or undemocratic regimes as well. For example, we have a growing Christian nationalist movement in this country that believes our founding fathers intended this to be a Christian nation. They see America as divinely blessed by God and fear that those blessings will be withdrawn unless the government enforces the proper beliefs and values and restricts the expressions of non-Christians. Obviously, this is the antithesis of a democratic order, and a budding authoritarian can make significant progress towards a dictatorship by aligning with a religious movement that is more concerned with achieving influence in this world than achieving citizenship in the eternal kingdom Jesus promised in the next world. And finally, we ask, will we be getting our anxiety medication during today's session? I'm sorry to say, I'm not able to prescribe. You will need to seek out your primary care physician. So as always, we begin with a review of what we've learned so far. We began with talking about the value of democracy and providing some comparisons to authoritarian forms of government. Then we talked about the elements or components that define a democracy, such things as voting rights, human rights, a constitution, the peaceful transfer of power, and the rule of law. But we also learned that a constitution is not enough, because you can never make up enough rules to govern every situation. What is required is accepted norms of appropriate behavior. And we learned that politicians must do three things to be considered loyal to democracy. They must respect the outcome of elections, reject violence and the threat of violence, and reject those who represent anti-democratic forces. Democracies can be subverted, and it typically happens from within, through capturing the referees, sidelining the opposition, and changing the rules of the game. So we began reviewing our democracy, and we learned that the heart of democracy is elections and their ability to determine the will of the people. While voter participation is probably our biggest problem, it is baseless worries about election fraud that has captured the attention of many. Consequently, there are those taking action to intimidate and threaten our election officials, resulting in resignations. We learned that vast amounts of money have been unleashed in our political system that bends our political system towards those with the money. And we learned about how norms are eroding, that they're the soft guardrails of democracy. As they break down the zone of acceptable political behavior, the zone of acceptable behavior expands, giving rise to discourse and action that degrade democracy. There are many historical reasons for the increasing polarization we see today, but we also learned that social media is corrosive to trust in our democracy. We learned how economic inequality contributes to social polarization. And we talked about the counter-majoritarian elements of our system. That is, those systems where the majority does not win, like the Electoral College, Senate representation, the filibuster, and gerrymandering. We learned that in a constitutional democracy, it stands or falls with the effectiveness and trustworthiness of the system through which laws are created and enforced. Citizens must have confidence that change can come through the law as opposed to violence. The peaceful transfer of power is an essential element of a functioning democratic government. Human rights and liberties. The U.S. has certainly documented citizens' rights and liberties in the law and established the institutions to defend them. The challenge has been extending those rights and liberties to ethnic and cultural minorities. Today, we will continue with our review and then finish by looking at some of the polls that measure our commitment to democracy. One of the more dramatic changes of the past 50 years is how the composition of the Republican Party has been evolving. I want to talk about this and its impact on the Republican Party's commitment to democratic values, norms, and procedures. For the past 50 years, the parties have been resorting themselves, and consequently, the separation or the polarization of the parties has become greater. This chart from the Pew Research Center shows how the ideology of members of the Senate and the House of Representatives has changed from the 1970s up through 2022. Down to the left side of each chart, we have the years, and across the top, we have a scale from liberal to conservative. The Senate numbers are on the left, and the House of Representatives is on the right. You can see that while Democrats, that is the blue lines, have moved slightly to the left to become more liberal, Republicans, that is the red lines, have moved dramatically to the right. The Republican Party has been changing over the years, leading to this more conservative lean. Let's look at how. Back in the 1960s, the Republican Party was composed of basically four groups. There were intellectual conservatives. They represent the traditional values and policies of conservatism, sometimes called the Barry Goldwater wing. Such policies as small government, little regulation, low taxation, strong defense, family values, sexual morality, social norms, public order, individual initiative, and thrift that leads to a sound economy and good character. Then there were the moderate liberals. They were typically center to center right economically, with social policies that were culturally liberal. Think of this as the Nelson Rockefeller wing. They favored a social safety net, but sought to run them more efficiently than Democrats. They opposed socialism and government ownership, and were strong supporters of big business and Wall Street, while still favoring some regulation. The wealthy and corporations, they preferred low taxes, little regulation, and few unions. Then there were the extremists. And in the core of this extremist strata of the Republican Party was the John Birch Society, racists, anti-communists, conspiracists, and anti-Semites. These folks tend to be very committed and willing to provide the arms and legs that can help win elections. The problem for the Republican Party at the time was how to harness the energy of these folks without being seen as extreme as these activists tend to be. Now, here is the composition in the 2020s. I debated whether to keep the conservative intellectuals as active members of the party or not. Many who are committed to the conservative intellectual tradition and thus believe in democracy and have left the party because they realize that being a conservative and being a Republican are no longer the same thing. Republicans such as Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Jeff Flake, and most recently Mitt Romney fall into this category. There seem to be some conservatives who still want the Republican Party to be their home, but they become very quiet and do not wield much influence. The moderate liberals have disappeared altogether. Typically, they were labeled as rhinos, that is, Republicans in name only, and have been chased from the party because they are seen as too willing to compromise with Democrats. The wealthy and corporations remain in the Republican camp, but the corporate commitment may be fading. Just last month, there was a study that claimed that corporate business leaders are drifting away from the GOP due to the ascendancy of something called stakeholder capitalism, which is an approach to business that emphasizes the importance of considering the interest of all stakeholders, meaning employers, customers, suppliers, and the community, and not just the profits of the shareholders. This approach reflects a belief in the importance of social responsibility and corporate citizenship. Additionally, the United States is becoming more diverse. Thus, businesses are increasingly realizing the importance of appealing to a more diverse customer base. You see this in the tremendous diversity of people in product advertising. In parallel, the workforce is becoming more diverse and the competition for talent more intense. So business leaders are understanding the importance of creating a more inclusive and equitable workplace. This often means supporting policies and initiatives such as LGBTQ rights, racial justice, and environmental protection. So the intellectual conservatives have gone quiet, the moderate liberals are gone altogether, and the corporations may be drifting. So who is left? Rural Americans have turned to the Republican Party due to a number of resentments that the party supports. Rural Americans tend to believe that the rural areas are being ignored by decision makers, that rural areas do not get their fair share of resources, and that rural folks have distinct values and lifestyles which are misunderstood and disrespected by city folks, that is, liberals and Democrats. The white working class has found a home in the Republican Party. These are the folks who left the Democratic Party in the 1970s once it was clear Democrats supported civil rights. They frequently feel they are losing their status as Americans due to social changes and rising diversity. They are defined by hostility towards Blacks, Hispanics, immigrants, and LGBTQ plus people, and concern about social and cultural issues. Evangelicals began migrating to the Republican Party in the 1970s as Democrats embraced social liberalism. They found common cause with Republicans on such issues as abortion, school prayer, and homosexuality. Now, this is a curious group because while the Bible's most frequently cited command is fear not, these folks have become afraid of nearly everything. Their status is being lost in a secularizing America. Their children are being groomed. Their guns are being confiscated. Their medical treatments are suspect. Their newspapers are lying to them. Their elected officials are not trustworthy. Their government is coming after them. Their faith is being banned from public life. Their leaders are being unjustly persecuted, and their nation is nearing its end. The most significant concern is the rise of what's called Christian nationalism. It's a version of Christianity and is one of absolute supremacy and believe that God intended America to be the new promised land. Thus, Christianity should be declared the national religion and its values guide the government. The church, in their view, answers to no one but God, and they are the authority to which the rest of the culture must answer. Asserting dominance over the culture is a precondition for dominating the country itself. These beliefs are distinctly at odds with a pluralistic democracy. And the same extremists continue to find a home in the Republican Party with maybe the addition of QAnon. But it is the last four of these groups that truly coalesced with the election of Donald Trump. He spoke to these folks in a way that no one had before. Trump turned previously politically apathetic people into ferocious partisans. They were convinced that they were on a heroic mission to save the country from an evil enemy seeking to overturn all they knew that was right and good about America. Consequently, the loyalty to these folks is not to the Republican Party or the conservative tradition, but to Donald Trump. They are now referred to as the MAGA branch of the party, that is, Make America Great Again. The MAGA branch is not conservative in any historical meaning of the word, so the problem for the Republican Party is not Trump so much as the Trump voters. Behind Trump is an audience that loves his brashness, his bigotry, his contempt for rules. No one seems to know exactly how big this group is, but among Republican leaders, these voters are now considered the base of the Republican Party, and no candidate can win without their support. They are forced to tiptoe around Trump to avoid alienating these voters. Actual conservatives may privately be disturbed by Trump, but are not able to stand up to him for the simple reason that he is enormously popular with the voters. So what is happening in the US today is no longer a contest of governing philosophies, that is, liberal versus conservative. It is a contest between those who believe America is an idea defined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and those who believe America is a people, a particular culture, white, Christian, and patriarchal. Trump represents those who want that culture restored to predominance. That is, they want to take their country back. This new Republican majority is convinced that Democrats are not simply the opposition party. Democrats are un-American, anti-Christian, socialist, communist, pedophiles, anti-family, racist, with a deep-seated hatred towards white people that are out to destroy everything that is good about America. The contest for them is no longer a fight against the loyal opposition. It is a fight against evil, those who believe that and find an authoritarian approach very comforting. Well, most of us grew up with a single news system reflected in the nightly news with Walter Cronkite and the Huntley-Brinkley Report. A parallel news system has emerged to support the Republican Party base. It offers safe spaces for their views to remain untouched by contrary facts, analysis, or interpretation. The information ecosystem of Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, right-wing bloggers, websites, and social media continuously reinforce their beliefs and confirm their worldviews. And yet, as angry as it may sound like these folks tend to be, they do not see themselves that way. They see themselves as a cheerful lot and a friendly lot. Here is a July 4th greeting from Congressman Andy Ogles from Tennessee that captures that sentiment exactly. Hey guys, Congressman Andy Ogles here, wishing you a happy and blessed 4th of July. Hey, remember our founding fathers. It's we the people that are in charge of this country and not a leftist minority. Look, the left is trying to destroy our country and our family, and they're coming after you. Have a blessed 4th of July. Be safe, have fun. God bless America. It's such a given that the left is horrible that no one blinks when it is cheerfully mentioned in a holiday greeting. And charges of anger and cruelty ring hollow to Trump supporters who can see firsthand the internal friendliness and good cheer that they experience when they get together with one another, say at a Trump rally. If you should attempt to attend a Trump rally, you will probably find it a very happy place where MAGA fans can be their authentic selves, comfortably surrounded by like minds and safe from the judgment and negativity of outsiders. They don't feel angry, at least most of the time. They are good, likable people who have just been provoked by a distant and alien left that many of them have never meaningfully encountered firsthand. However, while the MAGA branch may dominate the Republican Party, they are still a minority in America, and their ideas are not popular. Poll after poll shows that Republicans are out of sync with popular opinions on reproductive rights, gun violence, immigration, LGBTQ rights, and climate change. But because they believe the opposition is so corrupt, it is only reasonable to do whatever is necessary to keep Democrats from power. In other words, democratic traditions playing by the rules, the rule of law, are no longer the primary values for them. Keeping the opposition out of power is. When a party believes that only they should rule, even if they are in the minority, then you are seeing the emergence of an authoritarian, anti-democratic party. And this is their dilemma. How do you rule as a minority party when your ideas are so unpopular? First, as we discussed last week, rural interests in this country, which are primarily Republican, are exploiting certain counter-majoritarian institutions. This kind of snuck up on us. The framers of the Constitution allowed a small state bias, but it was not considered a rural bias because all states, large or small, were equally populated with small towns, farmlands, and forests. It was the intent of the framers that the House of Representatives be allowed to grow in conjunction with those states where the population was growing. However, when the 1920 census revealed that urban Americans outnumbered rural Americans, the House capped its numbers at 435 for the first time to keep power away from those urban dwellers whom rural lawmakers considered dangerous, meaning mostly immigrants. But even though both parties had urban and rural bases, and it seemed no party was benefiting unfairly from these counter-majoritarian institutions, the fix was now in against urban Americans. And as the parties resorted themselves, Republicans became the party of sparsely populated rural regions, and Democrats became the party of the cities. At the same time, urban centers were becoming engines of economic dynamism, good jobs, and diversity. Rural areas were stagnating, losing jobs, and remained mostly white. The values and needs became quite different. So the Constitution's small state bias became an anti-urban bias in the 20th century, and now has become a partisan bias in the 21st century. That means that rural interests, i.e. Republicans, are now overrepresented in three of America's most important political institutions: the U.S. Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court. Next, when you are a minority party seeking to retain power in a voting democracy, you must suppress the votes of those who will not vote for you or your ideas. Now, both parties are constantly engaged in efforts to change voting laws. The difference is that Democrats try to broaden voter participation while Republicans attempt to shrink it. And both parties are acting in their electoral best interests, but both are not acting in a democracy's best interest. The democracy's interest is in engaging more citizens in the process of democracy as to reducing their involvement. The Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institution, has called voter suppression the most serious threat to voting rights in the United States today. A couple of months ago, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, Laura, became co-chair of the Republican National Committee. One of her priorities was an increased focus on what she called election integrity. And the RNC now has election integrity directors in 13 states. Interesting, the leader of this new department is Christina Bobb, who is famous for promoting false claims of a stolen 2020 election and was just indicted in Arizona for participating in the fake elector scheme. According to Danielle Alvarez, a spokesman for the RNC legal team has been involved in more than 80 lawsuits in 23 states. So Republicans have been busily seeking to pass state laws that restrict the vote to those that will vote for them. They claim it is necessary to prevent voter fraud, but there's again little evidence that voter fraud has any impact on our elections. The Brennan Center has also found that these laws and actions have a disproportionate impact on minority voters. Here are some examples of their suppression techniques. Laws requiring voters to show a voter ID disproportionately disenfranchises minority voters who are less likely to have the required identification. For an example, a study by the Brennan Center found that voter ID laws in Texas are likely to disenfranchise about 600,000 minority voters. Restricting early voting, mail-in voting, and absentee voting make it more difficult for people to vote, especially those who work during the day or have difficulty getting to the polls on election day. Making it harder to register to vote discourages people from registering and ultimately voting. Banning voter drop boxes makes it less convenient to return a ballot. And expanding purges of voter rolls removes more voters from the rolls, often for minor errors or omissions. The Brennan Center's Voting Rights Lab, which tracks voting rights in the states, found that 19 restrictive voting laws were enacted as of May 29th in 2023, which surpasses the total number of restricted laws enacted in any year in the past decade, except for 2021, where 22 were passed as of the same date. Republican Party's commitment to democratic values and procedures has been steadily eroding for over the past 2 decades, and the momentum has accelerated with Trump's claims of voter fraud and stolen elections. An interesting sidelight to these suppression efforts is that many of the same folks who are targeting voter integrity are also active in our school board meetings and legislatures advocating for censoring and rewriting history in our school textbooks to minimize the harshness of slavery and racism. Texas, for example, will not allow it to be taught that slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from betrayals of our failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. In Florida, the State Board of Education approved a curriculum claiming that enslaved people quote, develop skills that, quote, could be applied for their personal benefit. It seems voter suppression and history suppression go hand in hand. One tactic is aimed at preventing historically disenfranchised communities from exercising true political power, while the other tactic seems to prevent the next generation from understanding why minority groups faced discrimination in the first place and how that legacy impacts present-day disparities in voting, housing, jobs, policing, and other facets of life. History suppression makes sense when you are trying to hold back the possibility of America arriving at the point where the majority of people in this country will be non-white. At least hold back the possibility that they will assume positions of actual power. The 2020 census revealed for the first time in US history, a majority of the population younger than 18 were people of color. The graduating high school class of 2022 to 2023 was the last in which white students were a majority. In the first 2 years following Trump's presidency, 19 states passed laws restricting how history and current events could be taught, the same number that had passed laws making it harder to vote during the same period. There was a remarkable overlap between the attacks on education and voting rights and the Republican groups behind them. Besides voter restrictions, state Republicans also seek to limit the power of government officials who do not agree with their views and priorities. Again, Democrats are just seen as so bad that they just cannot be allowed to rule. When Mitch McConnell showed symptoms of health problems in 2023, he began to pressure the Kentucky legislature to change the state's laws to remove from the governor, who is a Democrat, the authority to select a candidate to fill the unexpired term of a departing U.S. senator. This law passed over the veto of the governor. Unless a court intervenes, Republicans are now assured they will maintain control of McConnell's seat should it become vacant. In Montana, the Republican-controlled legislature barred Democrat Zoe Zephyr from speaking or even entering the chamber because she, quote, encouraged an insurrection when she held up a microphone to amplify the dissent of the gallery over a measure to ban gender-affirming care for minors. Republicans in Tennessee voted to expel 2 state representatives for staging a protest in support of gun reform. Texas passed a law abolishing the elections administration's office in a single county, the heavily Democratic Harris County, which includes Houston and 2 million voters. The law also provides a way for the state to assume oversight of the county's elections in the future. In North Carolina, a Republican proposal would change the composition of state and county election boards and give the Republican-dominated legislature authority to appoint board members. In Ohio, the citizens were pursuing a constitutional amendment for the November ballot in support of abortion rights. To block this amendment, the legislature attempted to change the approval requirements for constitutional amendments from 50% to 60% by pushing it through in a low turnout August election. This made significant news when the citizens turned out en masse to defeat this initiative and then ultimately passed the amendment. Once you have done what you can to suppress the vote and limit the power of the opposition, you want to find ways to enhance the power of Republicans. Racial gerrymandering continues in such states as Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana. Voting Rights Act's challenges are ongoing, but the resistance is strong. Last June, the Supreme Court ruled in Allen versus Milligan that Alabama Republicans must redraw its congressional map and add a second majority Black district. 1 month later, Alabama Republican advanced a new congressional map that failed to comply with the Supreme Court's decision. The district court, which initially struck this down, reaffirmed their decision Alabama appealed once more to the Supreme Court and was turned away. A special master was appointed who just completed redrawing the districts. As much as Republicans lost, you have to admire their tenacity in trying to maintain their advantage. Also in July, there emerged something called Project 2025. The Heritage Foundation and the Trump campaign found common cause in planning for a sweeping expansion of presidential power over government machinery if Republicans are returned to power in 2024. The legal theory being advanced rejects the idea that the government is composed of three separate branches with overlapping powers to check and balance each other. Instead, it is argued that Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president complete control of the executive branch. Thus, Congress cannot empower agency heads to make decisions or restrict the president's ability to fire them. Funds can be impounded that Congress has appropriated. Employment protections will be stripped from career civil servants in the CIA, State Department, and Pentagon if they are obstacles to the president's agenda. The Justice Department will be controlled by the president for the purposes of prosecutions. So if the president becomes so dominant, are we still a democracy or are we something else? On day one, we listed three basic principles that all politicians that are loyal Democrats must be guided by, and that is a small d Democrats, meaning those who are committed to democratic principles. So a reminder, they must always accept the results of fair elections, win or lose. They must unambiguously reject the use of violence to gain or hold on to power, and they must break ties to anti-democratic extremism. So how has the Republican Party fared on these measures? Let's begin with accepting election results. Donald Trump has a long history of refusing to accept defeat. During the 2016 election, he repeatedly told supporters that the election was rigged against him. So it was no surprise that he made the same claims of rigging prior to the 2020 election and then denied he lost after the election. But it wasn't just Trump who refused to accept defeat. It was the bulk of the Republican Party. As of December 16th, 2021, only 25 Republican members had publicly recognized Joe Biden's victory. The Republican Accountability Project evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress, asking whether they expressed doubt about the legitimacy of the election. A striking 224 of 261, that is about 86% of them, had expressed doubt. And on January 6, over 50%, that is 139 of House Republicans, voted against certification of the Electoral College results. State-level Republicans aided in this effort. 17 Republican state attorneys filed a lawsuit with the Supreme Court seeking to invalidate the results in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In a study of the 9 most closely fought states, the New York Times found that 44% of GOP legislators took steps to discredit or overturn the results of the election. What was now known as the Big Lie became an article of faith among Republican activists and a litmus test for candidates in Republican primaries. What about Republicans unambiguously renouncing violence? A few Republican congresspeople like Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, and Marjorie Taylor Greene maintain ties to paramilitary groups such as the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and begin to traffic in violent rhetoric, even alluding to the assassination of rivals in Congress. In April 2020, armed protesters with ties to the state Republican Party gathered around the State House in Lansing, Michigan, to protest COVID restrictions. 2 weeks later, they stormed the Michigan State Capitol. In the summer of 2020, several Republican congresspersons called for violence against Black Lives Matter protesters. Representative Matt Gaetz tweeted, "Now that we clearly see Antifa as terrorists, can we hunt them down like we do those in the Middle East? Republican leaders embraced Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old who crossed state lines with a rifle and killed 2 protesters. Trump received Rittenhouse at the Mar-a-Lago, while Marjorie Taylor Greene sponsored a bill to award him the Congressional Gold Medal. Republicans also championed Mark and Patricia McCloskey, a St. Louis couple who drew their guns on unarmed Black Lives Matter protesters, choosing them as featured speakers at the 2020 GOP convention. After the 2020 election, officials in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and other swing states received death threats from Trump supporters. And finally, on January 6th, President Trump urged his supporters to march on the Capitol to stop the certification of the electoral votes. When the march turned violent, he refused to intervene to stop it for more than 3 hours. Trump never denounced the assault and instead described it as the greatest movement in the history of the country to make America great again. There has been no Republican outrage against any of these violent events, much less any denunciation. Breaking with anti-democratic extremists and their supporters is the third principle of democratic behavior. An essential test for democracies is not whether authoritarians emerge, but whether political leaders work to prevent them from gaining power in the first place by keeping them off party tickets and refusing to endorse or align with them. Isolating popular extremists requires political courage. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy both knew that Biden won and were troubled by Trump's refusal to accept defeat and appalled by the January 6th insurrection. Both spoke out forcefully against Trump and told colleagues he should be removed. However, when it became clear that most Republican voters remained loyal to Trump, their courage crumbled and they reverted to appeasement, ceasing all criticism of him and voting against his impeachment and opposing any independent commission to investigate January 6th. McCarthy and McConnell did not actively seek to undermine democracy. They simply prioritized their career goals over its defense. Both leaders calculated that their political interests were better served by enabling Trump's authoritarianism than by opposing it. McConnell feared undermining his ability to win back a Senate majority, and McCarthy sought, above all, to become Speaker of the House. It's easy to identify individuals who make the head-snapping decision to reverse their opposition to Trump once his support among voters was recognized and has emerged as semi-loyal Democrats. But can we paint the entire Republican Party as anti-democratic? The Republican Accountability Project explored this, giving a democracy grade to all Republican members of Congress in 2021 based on 6 questions designed to measure their commitment to democracy. Here are those 6 questions. Did they sign on to the amicus brief to the Supreme Court to nullify votes cast in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia? Did they object to the certification of the Electoral College votes? Did they make public statements casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election? Did they vote to impeach or convict President Trump? Did they vote for an independent commission to investigate the insurrection? Did they vote to hold Steve Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with the House Select Committee subpoena? The scores are revealing. More than 60% of Republican members of Congress adopted undemocratic positions on at least 5 of the 6 questions. For those keeping score, that is a grade of F. Another 54 Republicans adopted anti-democratic positions on at least 4 of the questions. Thus, more than 80% of Republicans in Congress adopted mostly anti-democratic positions. Only 6% of Republicans behaved in a consistently democratic manner, and most of them had retired or lost primaries by 2022. In summary, the Republican Party refused to accept electoral defeat, it tolerated a violent insurrection, and it did not break with anti-democratic extremists or call out those semi-loyal legislators. In other words, GOP politicians violated all three basic principles of democratic behavior. In the world of electoral politics, defeat is normally costly. It brings internal recriminations, tarnishes reputations, weakens leaders, and sometimes derails careers. Competitive elections create a feedback mechanism that rewards parties that are responsive to voters and punishes those who are not. Losing parties are thus compelled to moderate and broaden their appeal to win again in the future. But none of that was apparent when the Republican National Committee held its traditional winter meeting starting after the attack on the Capitol. Donald Trump had experienced a resounding electoral defeat, and the party had lost control of the House and the Senate. Republicans have now lived through 4 consecutive disappointing elections in 2018, 20, 22, and 23. But the Republicans reacted to their setbacks by doubling down on Trumpism. So how does this make any sense? The GOP's reluctance to moderate, even in the wake of successive electoral disappointments, may be understood in light of the counter-majoritarian rules that allow Republicans to remain electorally competitive even without winning popular majorities. Republicans may use counter-majoritarian advantages to seemingly defy the laws of political gravity and hold on to power without broadening its appeal beyond its radicalized core of white Christian base. When that happens, the self-correcting nature of the electoral marketplace disappears, and it will remain prone to the kind of extremism that imperils our democracy today. So what can we expect from the Republican Party? Will it change? Will it moderate? Sarah Longwell is a Republican strategist who has been running focus groups with Trump voters for years. She concludes that these voters are no longer interested in any candidate that so much smells of an establishment Republican. Mike Pence, well, he seems like a perfectly nice man, but is just a puppet and doesn't have a spine. Nikki Haley, a milquetoast Republican and a status quo politician who's going to return to what everything was before 2016. And Ron DeSantis's big weakness, his before Trump political career. So he is seen as wishy-washy and not trustworthy, a more open borders Paul Ryan kind of guy, very much one of those political swampy guys. There certainly does not seem to be anyone who can out-Trump Trump. So Trump is in the middle of multiple lawsuits, which turns off the average voter, but the base of the Republican Party continues to see these lawsuits as the weaponization of the Justice Department against the former president. They see the Department of Justice as totally compromised by liberals and is only pursuing Trump to disrupt his chances of being elected. In Sarah's focus groups, when she asks her Trump voters whether they will be more or less supportive of Trump if he is found guilty, invariably they say they will be more supportive. It feels to them like an attack on Trump is an attack on them. The same dynamic was seen in the debates by the Republican presidential candidates. When asked for a show of hands of who would continue to support Trump, even if he were convicted of a felony by a jury, all but 2 candidates raised their hands. Their need to demonstrate their loyalty to Donald Trump held greater sway than their faith in 12 jurors sworn to be impartial, required to be unanimous in their verdict, instructed that the government has the burden of proving its case against him, and the evidence must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It becomes hard to see how this is going to change. I recognize that this is a pretty harsh verdict rendered on the Republican Party, and it is about this time that folks start wondering, well, what about the Democrats? Haven't they denied elections too? Well, the short answer is yes, they have. And it's a bad and toxic habit. There are good reasons to be critical of the Democratic Party and encourage them to do a little soul searching. So let's talk about this a little.
Criticism of the Democratic Party revolves mainly around three issues: Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, Al Gore in the 2000 election, and Stacey Abrams' 2018 gubernatorial run in Georgia. Let's deal with these in turn. Well, Hillary Clinton gave a gracious concession speech when it became clear she had lost to Donald Trump in 2016. She was also captured on video expressing the view that the election was stolen from her and that Trump was an illegitimate president. The stolen comment was made in 2019, almost 3 years after the 2016 election, and 2 weeks after the publication of Robert Mueller's report, which stated there had been a Russian conspiracy intended to help elect Mr. Trump. The illegitimate comment came in September 2019 in the midst of the Ukraine scandal, where Trump was trying to use military aid as leverage to demand that the Ukrainian president provide information that would damage Biden's election chances. This led to Trump's first impeachment, where he was already widely seen as illegitimate by his critics. In the almost 3 years prior to that, Clinton had kept a low profile and had refrained from attacking Trump's legitimacy. In one radio interview with NPR radio host Terry Gross, she was pressed on the issue of challenging Trump's legitimacy. Clinton said she would not absolutely rule it out in case more information about Russian interference came, but also she noted there seemed to be no legal mechanism for challenging his legitimacy. It is true that other high-level Democrats were more defiant. There were 7 Democratic House members that objected to the certification of their state's votes, but there were none from the Senate. This compares to the 139 Republican House members and 8 Republican senators who objected to the certification of Biden's election. And that's not to mention the massive Republican efforts at the state level, supported by 19 Republican attorneys general and coordinated with Trump's own legal team to invalidate the results in several swing states. And finally, there were the events of January 6th, when a mob of Trump supporters told by Trump to fight like hell to stop the certification of Biden's victory. And while there were some violent anti-Trump protests at Trump's inauguration day, they were not intended to reverse the election results, nor was any prominent Democratic politician cheering them on. In the hotly contested race between George W. Bush and Al Gore, there was a controversial Supreme Court ruling to stop a recount. Yes, Al Gore and many other Democrats expressed disagreement with that ruling. Some, like Hillary Clinton and DNC Chair Terry McAuliffe, claimed the election was taken away or stolen from Gore. The rhetoric was extreme and unwise, but there was no real proof that Gore would have won if the recount was allowed to go forward. And once the Supreme Court ruled, Gore conceded with no hedging or qualification and urged Americans to rally behind George W. Bush. There were 13 House Democrats that objected to the counting of Florida's electoral vote, but the objections went nowhere. And appropriately, it was Al Gore himself, as the current vice president, who presided over the counting of the electoral votes. Gore did later sharply criticize the Supreme Court in a pair of 2002 interviews, but that was the only time he spoke out on the issue during the Bush presidency. Perhaps the closest Democratic analog to Trump is Stacey Abrams, who refused to give a concession speech after losing the governor's race to Brian Kemp. Because Kemp was the Secretary of State and controlled Georgia's election machinery, Abrams claimed he was conflicted and rigged the election in his favor with voter suppression, purges of voter rolls, and poll closures. Her claims have been hotly contested, and currently there does not seem sufficient evidence to question the legitimacy of the election. So Democrats' acceptance of her stance is probably bad for democracy. But even so, the analogy to Trump does not stand up. First, we're talking about a gubernatorial election, not a presidential one. Second, while Abrams refused to concede, she also acknowledged the outcome and did not try to overturn it through junk lawsuits and mob intimidation. Clearly, there is a difference between non-concession and attempted sabotage of the election results. We should criticize Stacey for her lawsuit claiming Georgia's new election integrity laws amounted to an attempt at racist voter suppression. It was rejected by a Black judge appointed by Barack Obama, and we should also criticize President Biden's inflammatory references to those same laws. Yet there remains a huge qualitative difference between all of that and the Republican actions in 2020, and between the wave of election deniers who ran in 2022. So yes, there is some reason to criticize the Democrats for their election denialism, but the GOP's post-2020 election denialism is in an entirely different league. The ultimate defense of liberal democracy lies not in the Constitution and its rules, but in the culture, in free, informed, and principled citizens who will not tolerate the abuse of their democracy or their rights. Our democracy is dependent on a sense of legitimacy, that is, the belief and faith that people who have been given authority have a right to govern. They wield power for the common good. But recently, our legitimacy has been undermined. We have heard an election was stolen. Prosecutors are not serving the rule of law. Civil servants are nothing but deep state operatives. Proper skepticism has turned into widespread distrust, a cynicism that says there is corruption everywhere. So what do the American people think about the legitimacy of their democracy? How cynical are we? How committed are we? The Democracy Fund Voter Study Group surveyed attitudes among 5,000 Americans. 3 questions were devoted to attitude towards democracy and 2 towards authoritarian options. These were then correlated with various demographic factors. The good news is that the overwhelming majority of Americans embrace democracy. Consistently over the past 3 years, 87% of Americans say that a democratic political system is a good way of governing the country. But there was also some bad news. 24% had a preference for a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress in elections. This is significantly higher than several of our peer democracies, such as Canada at 17%, France at 12%, Germany 6%. Moreover, support for military rule has risen steadily in the US from 8% in 1995 to 18% in 2017. Compare this to Canada at 10%, Germany at 4%, Israel at 10%, and South Korea at 8%. So support for democracy was not as robust as we would be hoped. Only 54% of Americans consistently held a pro-democratic position. In fact, 28% gave a non-democratic response on at least 2 of the 5 items. The ambivalence towards democracy seems caught up in today's highly polarized politics. Trump supporters were nearly twice as likely to back a strong leader, like 29% to 16%. Americans who believe European heritage is important are 4 times more likely to favor a strong leader. While overwhelming majorities of the public say they support checks and balances on presidential power, pro-Trump Americans are 9 times more likely to oppose congressional oversight of the president. That is like 36% to 4%. As voters feel threatened by social, economic, and demographic shifts beyond their control, they are much more receptive to illiberal populists. The problem is not that an alarmingly high number of Americans are defecting from democratic ideals. The problem is that among certain Americans, levels of democratic commitment appears fragile and partisan. So let's wrap up. Is our democracy at risk? I think it is. It should be apparent that there are a number of weaknesses and friction points that challenge our ability to continue playing the game of democracy. So too many citizens do not trust our electoral process. Too many legislatures are willing to change the electoral rules to benefit their party. Too many citizens are relying on violence and intimidation rather than the rule of law for political change. Too much political tribalization is eroding the norms that make government work. And too many citizens see the opposing party as the enemy as opposed to the loyal opposition. Too many citizens are willing to believe their candidate over the findings of a jury. That is, loyalty to a candidate is taking precedence over the rule of law. Counter-majoritarian institutions are disconnecting government policy from public opinion and locking in minority rule. Money in politics is distorting the governing process. Loss of trust in our institutions and each other is weakening the country. And the Republican Party has become more authoritarian and anti-democratic. A Monmouth University poll released last year found that the vast majority of Americans believe that democracy is imperiled. What is confusing is not everyone identifies the same elements of a democracy as what puts us at risk. While much of the media worries about election denial and political violence, the poll found that most people believe the threat stems from corruption and the worry that the government no longer works for all people. And what we all now know is that neither of those views is wrong. When I gave this course last fall, it was not clear how those who were undermining our democracy would be held accountable. But now it appears the American legal system is responding. While many of our institutions appear on shaky ground, the success of our legal system, as slow as it may be, should be a source of genuine hope. For example, Fox News, who repeated and amplified the narrative about a stolen election, has agreed to pay $787 million as a defamation settlement with Dominion Voting Systems, and multiple defamation cases continue against other media outlets. Rudy Giuliani has been ordered to pay $148 million for defaming 2 Georgia election workers. Several of Trump's lawyers are facing disbarment or censure for their role in assisting Trump in attempting to overturn the election. Congress responded to the January 6th insurrection by passing reforms to the Electoral Count Act. Trump's team sought to take advantage of the ambiguities in this act as a means of overturning the election. The reforms would make a repeat performance of that attempt far more difficult. The independent state legislature doctrine that would empower state legislatures to dictate or distort the outcomes of federal elections was rejected by the Supreme Court, deeming that partisan state legislatures are still subject to review by the courts. The Department of Justice has secured hundreds of criminal convictions of January 6 rioters, including seditious conspiracy convictions for some individuals. 7 states were engaged in a fake elector scheme to assist Mr. Trump. In Michigan, 16 people have been charged with felony counts of forgery and conspiracy to commit election fraud. In Wisconsin, 10 people are being sued for their role in submitting false certificates of electors. In Nevada, 6 fake electors have been indicted. Georgia has indicted 3 fake electors in a RICO conspiracy. In Arizona, the Attorney General's office returned an indictment of the false electors in that state. The fake electors in New Mexico and Pennsylvania avoided prosecution because their fake ballots included a conditional clause that they were only to be used if a court overturned the state election results. In what may be the case for defending our democracy, Donald Trump has been indicted by the federal government for multiple conspiracies against the United States, all designed to keep him in power against the will of the voters and in violation of the Constitution. And Georgia followed suit, but is prosecuting Trump and 18 co-conspirators as a criminal enterprise under the state's RICO law. While we have identified a number of anti-democratic trends today, much of this is not really new. Historically, there have been multiple eras when anti-democratic forces raised their heads and sought to impose a different kind of government. But so far, democracy has survived. The founders recognized the radicalness of what they were proposing, that all human beings were created equal and equal in their possession of certain natural rights that government was bound to respect and to safeguard. And they feared it would be hard to sustain popular support for these revolutionary principles found in the Declaration of Independence, because they knew that many Americans did not, in fact, believe in those principles. But the founders did not insist that citizens believe in those principles. One could be an American, whether one believed in the Declaration or not. During the Civil War, it became obvious that a great many did not. South Carolina's John C. Calhoun called the very idea of equal rights a false doctrine. Southerners would claim a belief in democracy, but only if it was exclusively a white democracy. When it became clear that their freedom to hold human beings as property was being prohibited, they rebelled and sought an exit from the system. Although the South was militarily defeated, its hostility towards the founders' principles did not abate, and the rebellion has never gone away. It continues today among those claiming that society is depriving of their right to live according to their religious teachings, and those who are furious that various minorities are being favored at their expense. James Madison acknowledged that no government could be sustained if the people themselves did not have sufficient dedication to the ideals of the Declaration. The people had to value liberty, not just for themselves, but as an abstract ideal for all humans. What the founders counted on was that those attracted to the democratic ideals would ultimately become dominant, but recognizing it is up to individuals to carry the democratic ideals forward. So let's get a little personal. Imagine a candidate you like. This politician has everything, the right positions on taxes, abortion, foreign policy, and immigration. She has sound judgment and enough personal integrity to be trusted with your wallet. Now imagine that this candidate does or says something anti-democratic. For no particular reason, she shuts down polling stations, or at a rally, she tells supporters that a particular journalist is asking too many questions and might deserve to get rabbit punched on the way to his car. Would you change your vote? In 2020, an article appeared in the American Political Science Reviews that surveyed almost 1,700 people and posed a version of that scenario I described. While everyone says democracy matters, how many voters will defect from a candidate they otherwise support, but who does something destructive of democratic norms? Their answer? About 3.5% of voters. 3.5% does not sound like a very healthy number. It means that nearly everyone you know who says democracy is the highest priority is basically lying, which probably includes you and me. That people in that 3.5% come from the right and the left in equal proportions, but they tend to be the moderates from each side. The most partisan voters are least likely to change their vote, which suggests that partisanship encourages more anti-democratic action. If a democracy is to survive, it is up to the people who are part of that democracy to put the concern for democracy above all other partisan concerns. So will you be one of the 3.5% who will reject those candidates who are not clearly in favor of democratic principles? Supporting democracy must be an entry-level position for any candidate running for office. If democracy is a game that we want to continue to play, we as voters must be prepared to recognize those who have an anti-democratic bent and be willing to reject them, even if we like their positions on the issues. We must reject those candidates who do not accept the results of free and fair elections, meaning those who do not consistently and unhesitatingly accept defeat. And we must reject those who do not unambiguously renounce violence and the threats of violence as a means of political change. And finally, we must reject candidates who do not clearly break with anti-democratic forces, meaning those who claim to support democracy but turn a blind eye to violence and protect authoritarian extremists. But here is the difficult part. Research finds that rarely does anyone in this country consciously oppose democracy. A just published research paper shows that citizens who consciously support democracy can support undemocratic actions on a large scale when it suits their political interests and not recognize the contradiction. So, for example, presidents of both parties will claim the support of the people when they sideline Congress and expand executive power. The partisan mind will rationalize this violation of democratic norms as for the greater good when it supports their political preferences, and yet be opposed to it as non-democratic when it is their opponents engaging in this same behavior. Thus, we end up highly critical of the bad behavior of the other side, but blind to the anti-democratic behaviors of our own group. The hope for this course is that you'll be more consciously aware of the essential elements of a democracy and recognize when they are being defended and when they are being assaulted. And you will not be blinded to the anti-democratic behavior of your own group. I want you to come down on the side of defending democracy independent of your political preferences. Here is a quote I like from Liz Cheney that I think nicely captures the attitude we all need. Our institutions only hold when men and women of good faith make them hold, regardless of the political cost. My fear is that when we are so tribalized that the defense of democracy itself may become a partisan cause, and we must prevent that. It must be in our DNA to support a culture of moderation, of norms of tolerance and forbearance, and adherence to the rule of law, respect for the rights of others, support for independent courts, checks and balances, a free press, and neutral institution like election boards to arrive at honest outcomes. But in a culture as noisy as ours, in a world where social media algorithms automatically promote the most emotional thoughts and messages, moderation can get drowned out. Restraint can seem like a weakness. What we have learned is that the democracies are fragile because they require so much cooperation from so many diverse groups that must all have the same commitment to playing the game of democracy. If democracy fails in America, it will not be because most Americans demand a non-democratic form of government. It will be because an organized, purposeful minority seizes strategic positions within the system and subverts the substance of democracy while retaining its appearance, while a less well-organized majority doesn't care enough to resist. In other words, it will be because the majority are complacent and take democracy for granted. This concludes our course, so I thank you very much for attending. Please submit your 3x5 cards and your evaluations at the back of the room. Thank you.